Well, it's getting amazingly quiet, which means it must be time to start. Welcome, everybody. There are a couple of chairs over here. Christina, if you want. We're delighted that you're able to join us today and tomorrow for our and Sonic Network Theory workshop. In a few minutes, I'll go back over a little bit of the history of this, but for right now, we're going to start with our opening remarks from our benefactor and dean, Ernie Wilson, who in the past has participated in this conference. In fact, gave a paper here 2 years ago with a colleague on network externality. So, Ernie, we're delighted to have you here again this year, and we give you the floor.
Thank you. Can I take the floor from here?
Sure.
First of all, I want to welcome all of our friends and colleagues who come from near and far from off the campus. We welcome you to sunny California. We hope they stay sunny over the next 48 hours or so. But Peter said that I'm the benefactor, but actually the AND group, the Annenberg Network of Networks group, is really our benefactor, because Peter and his colleagues do such good work for, I think, not only the school, but I do believe for social science and knowledge creation and distribution more broadly. And speaking very personally, this is sort of my favorite event of the year, because I get to come in and sit down and be involved with a group like you, and I get caught up on the critical issues that are facing the field of communication, et cetera. So it really is a pleasure to welcome all of you. The topic that you are addressing today is hugely important. It's important for all of the social sciences, for humanities. It's important for public policy. It's important for political agitation and mobilization. And I really look forward to seeing the papers and having an opportunity to speak with some of you here. And I sort of like to put a little bit of a challenge to the group. Number one, it's something that my colleagues and I have been working on, and we're trying to figure out here at the Annenberg School for Communication. One of the questions is, what are the unique perspectives that the field of communication brings to these kinds of topics? I think that the more work that we do with engineers and economists and social psychologists, the more the question turns back to us, well, what do you bring uniquely to the table? Or for those of you who work on this particular topic, what is the value added that you bring that distinguishes this epistemic community from, let's say, neoclassical economists, for example? And lately I have found this question coming up not only from my colleagues in the economics department or political science, but more and more from practitioners, more and more from community groups, more and more from Hollywood moguls, more and more from people at the World Bank, more and more from my colleagues in China. And they say that we understand that communication is important, but when we get a group like this, what do you bring to the table that is unique and that I couldn't get from other intellectual traditions? So that might be something that you might want to think about as you do your work over the next couple of days. And of course, the second part related to that is, what downstream impact does our work have on practitioners? We, of course, want to stick to the highest standards of intellectual integrity and analytic rigor, and at the same time, our work does have impact on the real world. And clearly, I suspect by your topic of network social movements and network theory, you clearly recognize that and you're addressing it. And I would just urge all of us to tease out both the network theoretical aspect of that, as well as what does it mean for the practitioners who are engaged in social group. So with that, let me again welcome all of you here to sunny California, the left-hand coast, et cetera, to the University of Southern California, the Annenberg School. And I hope, and I'm confident that this won't be the last opportunity that those of us here at the school have to interact with you. And I look forward to having some conversations with our colleagues as this day goes on. Thank you very much. And I do want to thank Peter and his group. They do this every year on a shoestring. And as the chief bureaucrat, I really do appreciate them. Thanks to Peter and Manuel and other colleagues here.
Okay, thank you, Ernie. I wanted to start off our session here. Great. I am me. On a touch of on a celebratory note. And for many of you who are our guests who would not know this, Manuel Castells has been honored with the Holberg Prize for the year 2012. It's a real significant achievement, and even if it were not a significant achievement, the fact that it has $775,000 would make it something we would all aspire to. So, Manuel, congratulations.
Can I just
Not
say
to be
a couple
out,
things?
not to be outdone.
One thing, because you say. So first, the committee apparently named as one of the main reasons our work in the research group on network theory, etc.
Really?
Okay.
Uh-huh.
The other thing is most of this money will go to support the war in Afghanistan because these taxes for Obama.
Another kind of network.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I wanted to mention is that our dean, Ernie Wilson, has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So that gets us off to a good start. I wanted to mention just a couple of things that are sort of in way of getting us started. We've been doing this now for 4 years, and every year it turns out that our AND conference is a bit different from every other year, but basically the way we do it, and as you look around the room and see the people who are here, is that we sit around and talk about what would be a really interesting theoretical set of issues to deal with regard to networks, and then we ask who are the most important, interesting people in the world that we could invite to come and talk with us about that. The first year we talked primarily about network theory in the abstract. The second year we talked about multidimensional networks. There's a special issue of the International Journal of Communication that provides the papers from that particular conference. Last year, we're now alternating it so that 1 year it's at Northwestern, where Nash is with the Sonic Lab, and 1 year it's here. Last year we were at Northwestern, where we did Net Science meets Web Science. Very interesting conference with a lot of people from the web science area. And this year, of course, we were very interested in the opportunity to talk about and to study social movements. So as you look around the room, the reason you're here is because we thought you would be great people to just spend a lot of interesting time talking to about these particular ideas. Our format is, we could have asked any of you to give the talks, but we try to keep it limited to a very small number of talks. Give an hour to each talk so that we have plenty of time for discussion. So the talk usually runs about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, but that gives us roughly 30 minutes for the rest of us to join in and to share in the ideas that are here. So that's the format over the next 2 days. We will conclude on Saturday afternoon with Manuel talking about the ideas that are at the center of his most recent book, which he's just finishing up now. For more pragmatic details,
It's here.
thank you. You have on the thumb drive that is out where you picked up the packets is the list of participants, the papers from people who are making presentations, reimbursement forms for you, and so on. So all of the kind of things you would normally find in the little paper packets, most of them practically are in here. And so if you have any questions, I just want to point out most of you have met Amanda Beacom, who has spent a great deal of time organizing the conference for us. She's available and very knowledgeable and available to help in any questions you might have. Do feel free to ask Janet or Nash or myself or Manuel about any other questions you have, and we'll do the best we can to help you. So I don't think we want to spend a lot of time talking about pragmatics, and so I'm going to give Nash his opportunity to talk very briefly.
It'll be very brief. Just welcome everyone. It's been an honor working with the AND group over these meetings, and I think, you know, as Ernie was just saying, it doesn't seem like we've been doing this for 4 years, but every time it's been a really exciting and eventful event that many of us remember as an important sort of turning point in our intellectual journey. So I'm really looking forward to continuing that journey here with this group.
Okay. Yeah, also there are bios for people in here, so if you want to know more about somebody who's speaking, it's in here for you to do. Sasha is our first speaker. Come on up, Sasha, and you have the next hour for us and our discussion over your ideas on Occupy.
Can we connect this to the audio?
Yes.
This runs to the... Actually, I'm going to need a mouse, which is my bed. I don't think so. Not getting a...
You need a flash drive?
I don't need the flash drive, just for some reason. Oh, there it is. Great. Thanks. Sorry about that. So morning, everyone. I'm going to be talking about media culture in the Occupy movement. I'm happy to be here and to see a number of familiar faces. I did my doctorate at USC Annenberg and also did a postdoc here. And I'm now at MIT's Comparative Media Studies program. I'm also a faculty fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School. And I'm a co-principal investigator with Ethan Zuckerman and Mitch Resnick of the Center for Civic Media, which is a Knight-funded center that sits at the intersection between comparative media studies and MIT's Media Lab, where we work on the intersection of participatory media making and civic action. And I also happen to be one of the co-founders of the Occupy Research Network, which I'll be talking a little bit about today.
This group has seen to be that 99% of the country don't have control of the wealth that they should, is not evenly distributed. Mic check. Mic check. I'm at a loss for words. But even me being at a loss for words, is amplified. They want to know what the end game is? This is the end game. You doing your job? Everybody here with a camera? Everybody here with a computer? Everybody here with a smartphone? Everyone here with a voice? Do your job. And spread the word. For the people who are sleeping here, you inspire us. If you are inspired by them, make it grow. This is the end game. It's about growth now. We have to grow. And that's the point. I love y'all.
That's a scene of the technique that's known as the people's microphone, as being used by Talib Kweli, who's a well-known hip-hop artist, along with Mos Def. They had a chart-topping album called Black Star back in the 90s. He's visiting Occupy Wall Street during the second week of the mobilization, and he's using the technique of the people's mic to articulate, on the one hand, the idea that one of the key aspects of network social movements and of Occupy Wall Street in particular is the idea of amplification and circulation of movement voice. And he's also sort of articulating the idea that Occupy Wall Street is about prefigurative politics. So as he's claiming, this is the point is growth, the point is to be here and to participate and articulate sort of together the world that we want to see. That's what we think of in terms of prefigurative politics. It will lead us later into a conversation about movement outcomes, which will be really interesting when we get into the discussion with the Israeli case and the Spanish mobilizations. We were talking earlier on the bus today about sort of political and policy shift outcomes from the Israeli case. Occupy Wall Street obviously so far hasn't had a clear policy outcome, but it has had important mobilization and discursive outcomes. So today what I'm going to talk about is give a little bit of a brief background overview of the development and spread of the Occupy Wall Street movement, partly looking at key moments and key media texts as they circulated across platforms. Then I'll throw a few key concepts out into the world. These are ideas that I'm thinking of as I try and sort of understand the relationship between the radically changing media ecology and the network social movement space in a way that's more complicated than thinking about sort of a particular platform being causative for a particular mobilization moment. I'll give an overview of the Occupy Research Network, and then I'll walk you through some of the media practices and media culture within the Occupy movement and use that as a lens through which we might think about how do we rethink media practices across different social movements, both across physical locations, but also how do we look back at previous social movements and mobilizations and rethink them through the lens of what we know now about participatory media making and what that does as people generate movement identities. And then we'll talk. Does that sound good? I don't know if I can do all that in an hour, but I'm timing myself, so I'll try and skip quickly. So of course, Occupy Wall Street is directly inspired by the Arab Spring. The first call for Occupy Wall Street is put out early on in the summer of 2011 by Adbusters magazine. This is the iconic poster. Occupy Wall Street, September 17th, bring tent. The other tagline that was often used is, "Are you ready for a Tahrir moment?" It then gets, there's a small group of people, probably less than 50, who are spending time sort of organizing with pre-planning meetings. This is September 3rd pre-planning meeting in Tompkins Square Park of the initial core group of activists who are talking about actually setting up a camp. And it starts to get really interesting when Anonymous, the global distributed project identity of politicized hacktivism, puts out a call supporting the call to Occupy Wall Street. And actually, I have a video of that. This isn't that video. This is a video that Anonymous circulates on September 28th after things have already kicked off. But Anonymous puts out a call for people to support Occupy Wall Street about a week and a half before September 17th. I'll play a short clip from this because it's interesting. This comes after the events have actually already kicked off. There's just dramatic music. There's the history of Anonymous, which moved from being a griefing organization against the Scientologists to a more politicized project identity, especially around the Arab Spring.
People of the world, we are Anonymous. As many of you are aware, over the past several days, significant demonstrations have been held in protest of the corrupt financial system that favors the richest 1% of our nation, while the remaining 99% have to deal with things such as abuse of our civil rights, overseas outsourcing of our jobs, and living off minimum wage while gas now is around $3.50 a gallon. The minimal attention given to these demonstrations has caused growing concern, with rumors of media blackouts and repealed news coverage becoming increasingly harder to deny. We would like to thank those in our national media that chose to cover the truth about the events of the Wall Street occupation. Your contribution to society will not go unrecognized. Unfortunately, this coverage has not been sufficient. We must now take efforts to spread the truth into our own hands. It is now up to us, the people of this great nation, to act for ourselves. We must share the truth through our social networks, by texting, instant/private messaging, posting, and blogging to our friends and relatives. We must take to the streets and speak of the truth in our coffee shops and mall outlets. Our voices will be heard. Bloggers, dedicate your blogs to Occupy Wall Street. Website numbers.
It goes on like that for a while, but what's interesting about it is they're talking about transmedia mobilization, so they're calling on people to come out into physical spaces and occupy and mobilize. They're calling on people to produce media and circulate it through their social networks. It's interesting that they're simultaneously talking about the rumored media blackout, which as we'll see in a moment was not really the case, but they also sort of take the moment to pause and thank members of the press corps who have been doing coverage. So there's this sort of like inside-outside strategy and mobilization of rhetorics of participatory media production happening there. So Occupy really actually starts to gain increased visibility through more highly trafficked blogs after this incident, which is when Anthony Bologna pepper sprays Chelsea Elliott, Jean Mansfield, and a third woman on September 24th. So this is the second weekend. And raise your hand if you've seen this clip before. So like 2/3 of the people in the room have seen this. So this is interesting because it's a sort of moment where you see a peaceful assembly, you see these young white women being kettled by NYPD, and you see the white-shirted officers, and this is Anthony Bologna who comes and sort of, he's going to pepper spray them in the face. This video, of course, is produced partly through the Anonymous network using practices that called doxing. So basically people who have used sort of network tools to organize information about particular targeted individuals, either for purposes of just general harassment, for purposes of having fun, all of that sort of plethora of strategies that people use in online spaces starts to get turned to attention around political mobilization during Occupy Wall Street. So a lot of people who identify with the Anonymous network end up spending time identifying particular individual officers, zooming in on badge numbers, seeking records, and then feeding that into the legal teams that are actually then bringing legal actions against officers who are violating people's rights. So this video gets picked up by a lot of progressive blogs and gets very widely circulated, and also gets picked up by broadcast local television news. And this is when you start to see visibility of Occupy move beyond the very closed sort of internal networks of the primary participants into a slightly broader media space. It really blows up. It really blows up on Saturday, October 1st, when 700 people are arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge. And that's when it becomes a national story. It becomes front page news in a number of national newspapers, and it gets very widely picked up by the broadcast media. And that also then triggers basically a lot of local occupies then start to spring up around the country, especially following that moment. So this is a map using the Ushahidi software, looking at the locations of Occupy actions and local camps for the October 15th Global Day of Action. So there's about 1,200 local actions that happen at that time. This is actually current. So there's nearly 7,000 arrestees, through the Occupy movement at this point. This is verified arrests through multiple sources, tracked by a Twitter account called Occupy Arrest that you can sort of look at the arrests. And actually, I'd love to see someone do some more work on tracking sort of arrests as indicators of intensity of social movement activity across local locations and how that maps onto other types of social media activity. But what I mentioned before in terms of the sort of mythology of the media blackout, the reason that one of the methods that myself and my colleagues at the Center for Civic Media have been using to try and understand what's actually happening in terms of the correlation between the social media space and what happens in print publications of record is this sort of front page newspaper analytic comparison. So this is work that I'm doing together with Pablo Reymason, who's a visiting research scientist at the Center for Civic Media, comparing social media coverage with front page surface area. So you can see here, these are the front pages of newspapers. Each vertical column is a day. These are the major papers of note. The part that's been highlighted in red is the article that's actually covering the Occupy movement. And then you can then calculate the surface area of the front page, which ranges between about 0 and 20% during this course of time, which ends with the displacement of Occupy Boston, the eviction of Occupy Boston in December. I mean, we have more, but this is what we have at the moment. So what's interesting here, right, is that you can see that where do we start to get the first coverage? The arrest on the Brooklyn Bridge is really when you start to get you get front page New York Times coverage, and that sets off sort of the first wave. The arrests at Occupy Boston get some visibility, and October 15th, the day of global action that I showed you that map of a second ago, you get a real spike with multiple major papers covering that action. And then the major camp evictions, all of them are spikes. So the eviction of Occupy Oakland, and of course the day of the most coverage is the eviction of the Zuccotti Park, Occupy Wall Street initial encampment. That it gets front page coverage on almost all of the major papers of note. And Pablo's been doing this work on a lot of different stories, so tracking different stories using this method. And it's something that, of course, media scholars have done for a long time. What's nice is that we're building a set of tools. So in the past, you would have, used an army of graduate students to track down all of these front pages and scan them, and then you would measure them, and then you would enter them into your database. And so what we're doing is we're actually developing and releasing a free open source tool, which will allow people to do this kind of work in a distributed manner. So you choose a story you want to follow. You have a team of people that sign up to participate. We're automatically going to scrape the front page, of all the papers that you want to follow, and then people on your team can kind of, they get a little user interface with a yes, no. Does this front page have a story about the topic you're following? If yes, then they select and highlight the area that they're covering, and then we automatically calculate the percentage of the surface area. So anyway, that's free open source tool. I can send you all the link if you're interested. That'll be sort of ready for testing this summer. So anyway, that's a little bit of sort of the chronology of the sort of media space of Occupy. Now I'm 14 minutes in, so I'll have to jump more quickly through some of the other stuff I was going to do. Some of the key concepts I'm working with. This is my running definition of media ecology. So So I'm really interested in what's happening across multiple platforms. I'm interested in the affordances of the platforms as well as the political economy of those platforms. And looking at sort of what I'm calling a read, write, execute media literacies. So the shift from sort of read-only media literacies to the ability to also produce. Read, write, execute means not only do you know how to read and produce participatory media, you also have a sort of either tacit or explicit knowledge of how you can deploy that type of work towards civic action. And of course, there are legal and normative constraints on speech. This is what I'm working with in terms of social movement media culture. And these are all, temporary definitions that I'd love for us to talk about a little bit in the Q&A. Again, sort of, broad definition, but really trying to emphasize that things are happening across multiple platforms, that a lot of what's important isn't just the actual media production practices, but also the curation, amplification, and circulation of media texts. That's actually a lot of what most people who think of themselves as participating in, for example, Occupy, and I think many movements are actually doing when we talk about participating in media production in a movement context. They're not actually making a video. Only 8 to 10% of people are actually producing a video. Maybe 20% of them are writing a blog, and I'll show you in a minute where I'm getting some of that from. But it tracks really closely to what we know about general media production practices from folks like Pew. And this is from earlier work that I did around the immigrant rights movement in Los Angeles, which I think is going to be useful in thinking across different movement spaces. And of course, this is drawing on Henry's work around transmedia production practices, and I'm trying to think more carefully about how that links to the social movement media space. So the way that social movement narratives are generated and dispersed across platforms with different locations for entry for people who are participating at different levels of the movement activity. So how am I trying to get a handle on all of this stuff that's happening with Occupy? What methods can we use to really understand the relationship between movements and the media space? And I'd like to argue that the best way we can do that is by using very mixed and eclectic methods across a wide range of spaces, that just doing network analysis isn't really going to tell us the story, that just doing movement biographies, interviews, or surveys isn't going to, we're going to miss a lot if we don't use multiple methods when we try and understand movements in general, but especially the movement-media intersection space. It's easy to end up really focusing on a particular platform, maybe because that platform has easily accessible data. I like to call Twitter the Drosophila of social media studies, because why are we all using Twitter data to understand social movements? Because Twitter has great open APIs and we can get all the data from it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most important space for social movement media production and circulation. I mean, I do think it's important, but and so in order to do that, I'm partly inspired by the formal structure of what was happening with the Occupy movement. I, together with a number of colleagues, co-founded the Occupy Research Network on September 20th, 3 days after it looked like this was actually going to be something that was going to sustain and be an interesting mobilization space. We started with an Etherpad, where we asked people who were going to be researching Occupy to just start throwing up ideas, tracking stories, looking at different elements of the movement. That quickly got picked up and trolled heavily by some right-wing anti-Occupy people, so we moved to a space that required registration and login on Wikispaces, and then later we moved it to a free software platform, which is at occupyresearch.net. You can go there now and kind of check out what's happening. So the idea was to put out a call for an open, distributed, collaborative research space where people who were researching the Occupy movement, whether they identified primarily as academic researchers considering the movement an object of study, or they thought of themselves as occupiers who wanted to use research methods to better inform the movement activity they were engaged in, we thought we could set up an open space where people could share methods, tools, data sets, processes, and that's been incredibly productive. So over the course of the next couple months, that network grew very, very rapidly. We have about 350 people participating, using all of these methods and more, and clustering off into smaller sort of working groups within the Occupy Research Network to follow particular sort of projects through to their conclusion. And I'll just, I don't have time to talk about very many of them, but I'll mention one or two. So we developed the Occupy Research General Demographic and Political Participation Survey. This is a list of some of the folks who are in that working group and actually participated in developing the survey instrument, creating a guidebook that we use to train surveyors and how they could actually apply the survey. So we've got folks like Hector Cordero Guzman, who is a former Ford Foundation program officer who now teaches at CUNY. We've got Stephanie Milan, who's been here, I think, for one of these meetings. Zainab, who's been doing the most, some of the most interesting work on the Arab Spring in terms of surveys of actual, participants in the mobilizations, as well as people who like, MRoname74 and DJJ-RJR, who we've never met them face to face. They consider themselves occupiers. They talked about how they were working with a local research group within their Occupy, and they were interested in how you could actually do a valid survey. So basically we had this open space where people developed this together. We developed trainings, we conducted webinars where we trained people on how to administer the survey. And then just when we were poised to do this amazing national multi-site face-to-face survey with really nice set of questions about demographics and political participation, many of which were going to allow us to correlate with the general social survey questions, all the camps got raided and shut down in nationally coordinated actions, and so we ended up doing mostly online stuff. So which leaves us with an interesting data set of 5,000 survey respondents, which is non-scientific. So people ended up on this survey through Snowball, through Facebook and Twitter, and through their social networks. So we can't really make any claims about what we found in terms of general population of Occupy, but we do have some interesting sort of internal correlations inside the data set. And one interesting piece of that is that we did actually post this survey link to every existing Facebook group linked to Occupy, which we did using an iMacro script that automatically pulled from this database that had been compiled by another group. The categorical database working group within the Occupy Research Network has set up this really wonderful database that looks at sort of all the different existing camps and what types of facilities they had locally, what types of online spaces they had generated, this kind of stuff. And so we had all of the Facebook groups for 1,200 Occupy groups. And so what did we find? We've got, most of the people who responded to the survey had been to a camp. We asked them about what types of activities they did within Occupy. So 20% of them had slept in the camp. Most of them had been to a GA, a General Assembly. Almost half of them had been part of a working group. Most of them had marched in a protest. A quarter of them had organized an event or an action, and 4% of them had gotten arrested. We also asked them about what types of media production they had done, or where were they, how were they circulating sort of information about Occupy. So this is where I'm getting the 8% made videos, 20% wrote blog posts. Most of them, of course, circulated information about Occupy via social media. So we have a lot of this kind of stuff. It was not most people's first movement, so more than half of them said they had participated in other social movements previously, which was really interesting to us. And then this is sort of more detailed questions about, this is past 24 hours, past week, et cetera, in terms of did they use this form of media. And so all of this data is freely available. You can download it from occupyresearch.net. We actually created a number of different tools that you can use to browse the data. There's a faceted data browser where you can immediately do crosstabs by any of the variables that you're interested in. So that's kind of that. And so what we found, right, is that people use a really wide range of media. Social media was quite important. Live streaming was more important than some of the traditional sort of broadcast media in terms of where people were getting information on a regular basis. And we've started to do some of the crosstabs about which forms of media correlate with the more highly involved occupiers, and it's basically supports what we sort of knew anyway from a series of interviews we had done, which is that some of the key sort of media makers and organizers within the Occupy movement are using more autonomous spaces. So they're using IRC, Internet Relay Chat, back channels. They're setting up their own web spaces. They're using free and open source software. They're generating new code and new tools that occupiers are using to sort of communicate internally. So there's a whole sort of parallel universe of autonomous media infrastructure that Occupy sort of develops as part of its practice. And that's important to look at in addition to what's happening in the corporate social media spaces and print and broadcast media. This is a screenshot of the faceted data browser, which I was going to click through, but basically the idea is you have all of the survey variables, you just click on any of them and it immediately gives you the number of people, number of respondents with all of the variables you selected. So you can play with that, and it's a lot of fun. That was developed through one of the Occupy data hackathons. So the survey was one interesting outcome from this network. Interviews was also interesting. So there's a whole working group doing interviews, sharing protocols, uploading transcripts to a shared space, looking at them together. There's a series of focus groups that are happening, which are specifically about race in Occupy. And I think that those are really, really fascinating, sort of looking at those dynamics. And then we did the Occupy Data Hackathons, where the first one was organized by Arshit, by Leila, here at the next door at the Institute for Multimedia Literacy. So this was basically taking a shared set of 13 million tweets with Occupy-related hashtags and exploring in a weekend all the different ways that we might visualize this data. And it was coordinated through multiple sites. We've done 2 of these now, each one larger than the last. And the first one had about 20 participants, and the second one I think had about, I don't know, maybe 40 or 50 participants. So we had physical locations here in Los Angeles, in Boston, in New York City, in Oakland, in Utrecht. And where's Mirko?
Utrecht.
Hmm?
He's in Utrecht. Yeah.
Oh, okay. But he's not here today? I've never met him face to face.
Schaefer?
Yeah.
No.
I thought he might be, for some reason I thought he was going to be here. Anyway, so his team participated as well. And so this is us in the Google Hangout. This is the shared Google Doc that we're using to sort of coordinate all the activity. We started by sort of sketching different possible visualizations on a whiteboard and then translated some of those into actual implementations. So this is using free open source tools, processing to look at, this is just tweet volume over time. Each color is a different Occupy by the hashtag. So you can kind of track those across time. This is like Trendistic, only it's a free open source version of that. This is new Occupy hashtag users over time. This one is cumulative and this one is new. So you see when the spikes of new users come in. And of course, if you compare that to that initial thing I showed you of Pablo's, it just tracks very closely. So it's the same main events are what trigger the spikes. This is Mirko's team using Gephi to do an at reply visualization of 14 different Occupy hashtags. And so the color is the hashtag, which is tied to the physical Occupy site. The dots are the users. The proximity of the dots is frequency of at reply to that particular user. And so what you see is basically clustering. It's not surprising. This is Occupy Utrecht out over here on its own. This green, I think, is I think it's New York. Anyway, these slides are available online, and you can click through to actually read the papers that they've written about this. But so basically, what you see is that some of the physical Occupy sites are more tightly linked than others. Then we thought it'd be interesting to look at the content of the tweets, not by doing semantic analysis or natural language processing on the words in the tweets, but actually looking at the links. So this is in preliminary sort of exploratory visualization of the URLs that people are sending around using the Occupy hashtags. So you can basically sort by color, so you can see it over time, and you can see it by volume or frequency of that particular link being sent around. So this lets us look at when were people sending around the most links to donation. So was it to WePay or PayPal links that people are sending around? And of course, most of the donations come in, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars generated within the first few weeks, extending out to, I actually don't have the most recent WePay data, but they actually have a publicly available data set of all the donations to Occupy, and it's quite significant. Anyway, so you can see when those peak, and you can see when it's popular to send that type of link versus sending a link to a particular live stream. And so we did this by sort of parsing the URLs that people are sending around and doing a quick categorization of what type of site is it being sent to. That's just kind of fun.
How do you interpret that?
Oh, so this is interactive, so you can click through and you can sort by any of the link type, and you can then you can sort it by tweet count or by date. And again, this is something that was hacked together in a day. So our next stage would be, so if this was the web version, I would click through this and you would see particular streams of color that appear at certain times. So we have a number of ideas about what we do with the next step of this. I think I'd like to actually map this with tweet volume to actually color in the tweet volume based on the type of tweet that's being sent around inside there. But half an hour already? Well, I won't talk about this because maybe Gilad's going to talk about it later. Are you going to?
Yeah, you go.
Do you have this in your
Yeah.
stuff? So this is Gilad's work, basically looking at the evolution of the Occupy Wall Street hashtag networks. And basically what it tells you is that early on, you've got certain key actors like Adbusters and the Occupy Wall Street NYC account. And later on, the space becomes much more complex, it expands. You get folks like Huffington Post becoming sort of key nodes in the circulation of information using the hashtag and so on. So you can watch the evolution of the network over time, and you can say more about it later. I'll just skip this. And then we had fun. So this is our meta meme analysis of the pepper spray cop, which is composed of by scraping all of the tumblers where people were doing remixes of the pepper spray cop, and then using free open source tools to generate a giant recursive meme that, if you zoom into, it's all composed of other pepper spray cops. So fun is an important component of any good hackathon. So now that I've used up all the time just talking about the research network and our hackathons, I'm not going to have any time to talk about the theoretical components of media culture, so let's see, maybe I'll just choose a couple. I've already mentioned the shift from production to creation, circulation, amplification. I do think it's important for us to think about, let's see. Yeah, let's just do the people's mic quickly. Okay, so one of the key findings from the research that I'm doing outside of the surveys and the data visualization work. So this is coming from a series of interviews that we've done with people who are participating in the media working groups of Occupy Wall Street. So this is people who are at sort of the media tents and camps, which are the physical sites and locations where people actually are sort of producing media within the camps and training each other on how to do different types of media production and circulating it. So we talked to a lot of people about what they were doing, what types of tools they used, where they learned how to do this stuff, if they had done this type of work before. And one of the things that I think it's really important to emphasize when we're looking at Occupy or when we're looking at any social movement network and its media production practices or its media culture is to think about biography and life course and the way that people move from one movement space or one movement network to another one and actually bring sophisticated sets of skills from one place to another. And that's true across many different domains, including media production. So in Occupy in general, if you went to an Occupy camp, what you would find is about half of the people there, and this is, I'm getting that half from our survey, but I think that it also would bear out from a number of other folks who are doing work in this space. Half of them have never been part of a mobilization before, and they're just coming in and they're learning, they're getting politicized, they're learning how to do direct democracy, they're learning what it means to do this type of action. About half of them have participated in other movement activity. And so at Occupy, you've got the food tents set up by the networks of Food Not Bombs, which has been around since the 80s. You have the medical tents, which are set up and coordinated by the networks of street medics who actually come out of the anti-nuclear movement, again in the early 80s, and have a whole sort of nationwide network of street medics who have this practice and trainings that are ongoing where they teach people how to do first aid in the context of police repression, of civil disobedience and of protests. In the media tents, you have a lot of people who've come through previous movement networks, especially indie media. So at site after site, the interviews found that there were people who had helped found the media working groups and tents of the Occupy movement who had come out of the indie media network. In New York City, you also had a number of people who'd been part of ACT UP, New York, the mobilization to fight AIDS, who were graphic designers and media professionals who also got very heavily involved in working on media work in Occupy Wall Street. And this is a sort of interesting clip. Oh, it should have jumped right to the time, 1 hour. Let's see. This is a clip of the People's Mic being used in Seattle in 1999. Oh, sorry, that's after it's done. This is Tom Hayden from the Chicago 7 speaking to the crowd outside the jail Solidarity Action in 1999 in Seattle. anyway, these practices circulate across time and across movement networks, across different physical locations. Tactics get adopted, they get circulated through participatory media production practices, but also through individuals who participate in social movement networks. And we found that over and over again. So these are all images from different Occupy media tents. This is Occupy Boston media tent. And over here we've got a sort of little poster on the wall that explains how people can access IRC, Internet Relay Chat, one of the oldest forms of network communication that activists used during the fight against the Soviet Union to communicate across borders, and then used through subsequent social movement struggles and continue to use in Occupy. So at any given moment, you'd have about 300 people hanging out in the Occupy media team's IRC channel on a Freenode server, sort of communicating and sharing information about what was going on. And then here's sort of the World Social Forum in Brazil in 2009 with Indie Media Brazil setting up a similar type of space. Here's the G8 in Scotland in 2005. Same kind of space, the monitors are a lot bigger, right? So this is the kind of work and practices that we're doing. So we're looking at how these practices move across time and space. Live streaming became highly visible through Occupy Wall Street. Partly through the Global Revolution live stream. Raise your hand if you ever saw the Global Revolution live stream. So only a couple people, that's interesting. So Occupy has been the moment when live streaming, using commercial live streaming services like Ustream and livestream.com, has moved from something that was sort of done occasionally and marginally by groups like the Uptake in 2008 at the RNC, by Dream activists who sat in at McCain's office in 2010, and during the Wisconsin labor uprising in March 2011, it was a very marginal practice. It moved to be much more central part of participants' experience of the Occupy movement more recently. And there's a whole backstory there, which I won't go into because I've already taken up most of the conversation time, about activists who did that, who learned it from other movement actors. This is a map of all the live streams from Occupy Wall Street that's dynamic and you can access it at any moment in real time, that was produced by student of mine at the Media Lab, Charlie Bitar. But there's this previous history, right? So Deep Dish TV, Paper Tiger TV, this came out of New York City in the 80s. And they actually would pool resources to purchase a satellite truck so that they could do live streaming from mass mobilizations in the late 80s in New York City. And Dee Hallett, who's one of the key actors in Deep Dish TV, went on to help co-found Indie Media and do a series of trainings around how you do live coverage of protests all through the 90s and into the early 2000s. So the point again is that we need to look at what's happening in the social media space. We also need to look at the biographies of activists as they move across different locations if we want to get a good sense of what's really going on. I guess I'll do this for another talk. So these are all different characteristics of a social movement media culture. We can think about them in terms of whether they're the forces within a social movement media culture that push it towards open or closed, how horizontal or vertical the particular movement media culture is, whether the norms and expectations are that there will be a couple spokespeople who primarily speak to the media, or whether, as is the case in Occupy, the idea is that many people will learn how to articulate demands, and there's a specific sort of working groups that are set up for people to learn how to speak to the press. So I have this whole set of interview and pull quotes around these different types of practices within a social movement media culture. But I think I should probably stop there so that we have 20 minutes to talk. And if any of you have questions about them, then we can get into them more. The key conclusions, right, are that we need to use a diversity of methods to understand social movement media cultures, that they're rich and complex, that they exist within a rapidly changing media ecology, that there are transmedia practices that move across different spaces, and that texts get created and then recirculated between social media, print, broadcast, but also physical and face-to-face media spaces, and that's a really key part of what's going on. That there are people with a lot of deep experience in media production who participate in movements. At the same time, there's tactical innovation that takes place as new people come in and as the affordances of the technologies change. And that all movements, even ones that are ostensibly as open as possible, face sort of both open and closed communicative logics within the activities that they do. So that's kind of what I've got. And let's talk about it.
Thank you, Sasha.
wonderfully rich and contextualized talk. That was really, really interesting. I've got two questions. One is about the open and closed logics of the communication networks. And we've encountered that in an interesting way. We have a civic technology development project, and we've built a deliberation platform which can handle pretty large inputs, and it allows people to post issues, register positions on those issues, and then take other people's positions into account to indicate what they find useful, what they don't, and then to register their own positions, and then it sort of builds. And we are shopping this to the Tea Party and to Occupy. It's a sort of a controlled natural experiment. We're having more trouble getting uptake from the Tea Party, not surprisingly, because deliberation isn't one of their things. Or at least the kind of deliberation that we would sort of like to contribute to. Although we're talking to them still, but the Occupy has been really interesting in the sense that we're now talking with tech developers for Occupy who would like to create a virtual General Assembly because they see Occupy kind of collapsing in very small and increasingly radical cells that are having some trouble rising above those cells and reaching the peripheral audience that would continue to support their ideas and their actions. But that's the conflict. So there is a real conflict between the kind of most radical in-person networks, many of whom don't want to give up the communication space to unknown people, right? So there's a trust and a verification problem there quite seriously. But we think we can overcome some of the trust issues. But I think the bigger issue is the giving up of the communication space to unknown others, who might be very supportive, and many of these sort of in-person activists understand that they need general public support, but they're not quite sure how to go about getting it. So I mean, I wonder if you could comment on that. Are you seeing those kinds of tensions in the communication spaces and logics of differently positioned players in the networks?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the pieces that I have a lot of really rich interview data around is this question around transparency. What are the movement's mechanisms for internal and external transparency in decision making? I think it's an interesting question to ask about any social movement, media culture. And in Occupy, of course, we've got formal mechanisms for transparency, which of course are the GAs, open working groups, anyone can come into them, open note-taking practices, so a lot of interesting sort of live shared live note-taking via Google Docs or Etherpads, where as people are actually making decisions, that's all being shared real-time in online spaces that people also sort of access through links that circulate on social media. So for example, Boston GAs are both live streamed and also live noted, and people participate remotely, including some really intense and difficult decisions that Boston had to make around pushing out someone who had been involved in sexual violence against women inside the Boston Occupy space. And so there's this whole interesting sort of both real-time, face-to-face, augmented by virtual conversation that happened through a consensus process around pushing that person out. So there's these really interesting formal and informal mechanisms for openness in Occupy specifically, but that's countered by a lot of closed logics and pressures that lean towards closed, which include the hardening of the movement networks as people come to identify as the core activists and the rest of them, the emergence of security culture, especially once the police repression starts to happen against Occupy spaces. Of course, there's people then start to discuss, well, we need to close this space down, it needs to move more secure, be careful who you invite into the working group, we need to set up secret alternative locations where we can move our media operations in case we get cracked down upon. And then you have...
So to follow that point up,
Yeah.
who's in conversation with those who want to close and securitize the spaces? Because it seems to me that another way of looking at that drift or that trend is that it really walls the activists off from a more general public,
Right,
which
well,
is often thought to be important in social movement sustainability, legitimacy, and so on.
Well, it's totally complicated, right? Because on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to the idea that if the movement wants to grow, it shouldn't lean towards closed, it should continue leaning towards open.
Right.
At the same time, there's the reality that the movement is being infiltrated, surveilled, repressed, and
Yeah.
beaten,
No, I see
arrested.
that.
So
Absolutely.
people have valid reasons for thinking about security culture. These tensions happen in debates within the working groups. It happens in the GAs where actually, so the Boston Media Working Group, there was a consensus process where the General Assembly said there's no longer a Boston Media Working Group because they've become too closed. So they're no longer recognized by the General Assembly, and media production is now being done by everybody in Occupy Boston. So these debates happen at a local level within particular occupies, and then they also happen at a national level as people try and share sort of best practices through communicative networks like the Inter-Occupy folks. So this is a group that was specifically set up to like have this conversation across different spaces. What are the challenges you're facing, and how can we sort of resolve them? In addition to the these sort of formal processes that close and open, there's of course the classic other processes that militate towards certain kinds of closed logics that reproduce structural inequality. So this is the classic, well there's two. So one is the tyranny of structurelessness, which is a classic Joe Freeman article sort of critically analyzing feminist organizing that says, well look, just because you pretend to not have a hierarchy and say that you're a flat horizontal organization, in fact there are hierarchies that emerge, and when they're not named, it's actually more difficult to counter them. So it's better to have like the known hierarchy so that you can fight it. And then there are structural barriers. So it's, okay, great, everything's open. Anyone who wants to come down and participate in the working group can do so. Okay, well, who has time and energy? And then it becomes classed and raced and gendered in terms of people's free time, the resources they have to bring to bear, the level of technical skills or digital media literacy that they have that are structured already by race, class, and gender in the United States. So those things, if you don't take concrete steps to address them, end up just reproducing the structural inequalities of the broader society, even though your process is formally open, right? And then this is what you were talking about, the egos and the hardcore, like I'm a real occupier and you're not. And just before I get to other questions, is the open assembly thing, that's really, really interesting. So one of the things that's relatively unique about Occupy is a high level of participation by technologists and coders and people from the free software community. And so in fact with Occupy, the challenge is not to find a space where people can extend decision making into online. The challenge is the vast proliferation of new tools and spaces that people are radically and immediately innovating around. Oh yes, there's 100 new open assembly tools. So you could go to openassembly.org, you could go to occupy.net, you could go to, so there's 100 of them. And each weekend there's another group getting together and hacking up some new system. And so then it becomes a coordination challenge. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but it's not like how can it be extended into online spaces. It's how do you sort of create a critical mass around a tool that people will actually use. So I think Dana's next, and then.
I mean, it's actually building off of Lynn's point and building off of this, which is that these new technologies both sort of create these new ways of interacting with this media, but they also mean that it solidifies to just specific groups of people. And so we reinforce a certain kind of subcultural participation by taking it off of more of the mainstream, corporatized social media tools.
Right.
And so I'm very interested in this tension because in some ways we're getting back to classic narratives of subcultural capital, right? Just how does this dynamic flow in terms of who's in the know and who's actually spreading participation there. And so what I'm curious in drilling down is, given a media ecology where in theory anybody with network tech access could participate, and yet a dynamic where you actually have to know where to look, how does this tension play out in terms of participation? What kinds of ways does this reinforce, insider and outsider boundary work?
Right. So I think one of the most interesting places to look at that question is in terms of race and Occupy. And so we have the 4 focus groups around race and people of color's participation in Occupy and the feelings that they had about it and experiences that they had trying to participate in their local Occupy movement. So we've done one in Oakland, New York, Boston, and I think they did one in Los Angeles. And so some of the broader thing is that most local occupiers have not been able to effectively really deal with race in Occupy. And so the critique that Occupy is overwhelmingly white and younger and college educated has a lot of truth to it, although it's complicated and different occupiers have dealt with it to differing degrees. But so there are formal mechanisms for trying to address the structural inequality piece and how you increase participation. And so some of the formal mechanisms include things like the People of Color Working Group. The first one started in New York City after 3 young women of color blocked the consensus on the Declaration of the Occupation of New York because it didn't address questions of structural racism and gender inequality. And they actually blocked an assembly of hundreds of people to modify the language successfully, and then from that experience formed a POC working group that very quickly grew to have meetings of over 300 people at a time who identified as people of color, creatively and systematically thinking about how do we bridge structural inequality in a supposedly open movement space. Occupy the Hood emerged out of that work. You have procedural modifications like progressive stack. So stack is the process by which, Robert's Rules of Order or whatever. So basically people who are waiting to speak in a General Assembly, raise their hand, get on stack, get called on. So a lot of occupies came to consensus to adopt a progressive stack where you would prioritize the voices of people of color, women, and trans folks in their General Assemblies. And that was a really interesting moment when you modify the rules of participation in the physical space. And I think people are now thinking about what does that look like in networked and online spaces. And then informally, of course, people are just having this conversation. I'm not sure it really gets to your question, which was about like the tension between autonomous online communication spaces and commercial spaces, but
But it's what I'm trying to drill into is that so much of it is predicated on narratives of access, when in fact, actually, you see this about being in the know. And how do these network dynamics and being in the know, especially in an online environment, play out? Because the thing is that you have to be connected enough to those networks to even know that these sites exist.
Right.
Likewise, even within the very commercial sites, you have to be connected to the right people for information to flow for you and Twitter.
Right.
Right? And so it's like, how do you deal with that networked participation?
Yeah.
Where, again, it's this transparency and we have this opportunity where anybody in theory can get access, but being in the know is so difficult.
That's why I think it's a big mistake to just focus on any particular platform or space, and we have to really look across all different media spaces. That's why I'm emphasizing the transmedia mobilization approach. It's like that first graph that I showed that I'm working on with Pablo, or visualization, is about like when does the movement actually blow up and become more visible and actually open to people participating? Like what's that first touch point or entry point? It's not even Twitter, right? It's broadcast media. It's print publication and broadcast media. That's still how you're going to reach the vast majority of people, even in a highly, networked and connected environment. That really is the way that's when your movement blows up. Is when you get on the front page of all of the major papers, and that drives the broadcast coverage. And then, that's going to drive a lot more visibility in the social media spaces. And we know that. Like we know that that's how it works. And yet we still, because the new platforms are so exciting and we have wonderful network data about them, we spend all our time and energy thinking about how movements interact in those spaces, and I think it's a mistake.
Well, but I don't know.
Wait, we have
that's the
another.
way-
Sorry if I could just. You were first.
Sorry about that. Okay, so maybe this might touch on some of that, drifts off of these points. Basically, what I've noticed is the reason why you can't have a national or an international General Assembly is because this is actually a national collection of local movements. And so people focus mainly on local issues, and in doing so, the issues in Cleveland, which are fracking, are not the issues in LA. And so when you try to generate that conversation about how can we combat, globalized capitalism, people lack a lot of the tools to do that, right? They don't know who to address, they don't know how to address those issues. So what you end up with is when you do get a national thread, it's around distributed actions, right? So you distribute your actions against ALEC on a specific day, but you don't need a national General Assembly to decide that we're all going to fight this group of corporations in one day. So there's that, but I also wanted to ask you about, there is this really weird element that I've noticed in studying the networks that have formed out of this, what you're calling transmedia, which is the speed at which different networks solidify. And I wonder if we're seeing the dissolving of the media groups in Boston and Oakland. LA's down to, we're at 80. We're down to about 3 to 6 people on the media group. As these people learn this new media, this new technology, their networks became national very quickly. If, for instance, live stream, there was never an Occupy LA live stream, right? Because they didn't want to be part of the local assembly. They always wanted to be their own independent thing, but they also were very rapidly networked, the live stream. So I wonder if you've seen this effect where it's people who have the tools that to communicate nationally actually find less of a need for the local assembly.
Yeah, that totally happens. So I think that like as national networks form, people connect directly to them and then they bypass accountability to any sort of local structure, which can be a problem at the same time as is exciting because then you have these new national networks of media production spaces forming. In terms of what happens at the local level, this reminds me of one of the also sort of key points when we're thinking about what the outcomes are from a movement like Occupy. It's going to be really important for people to look at the local policy outcomes. And I'm talking about city level and state level outcomes. I know already in upstate New York, for example, so there's no policy outcome from the national Occupy movement. There's a discursive outcome, which is the ability to talk about wealth inequality on a national scale for the first time in 40 or 50 years. So it expands the sort of discursive bounds of what's politically permissible to talk about. At the same time, you are starting to see some policy outcomes. So New York, county by county, you mentioned fracking, and actually, so upstate New York has a lot of anti-fracking activity, and a lot of the people who came through Occupy local groups, then as the sort of winter wore on and the camps expanded, started figuring out, well, how could they take these new organizing skills and this new energy that they had developed in these new social networks of people that they had built around Occupy and apply them to some particular concrete local policy outcome. And so now we went from 5 to 10 counties that had bans on fracking in place to something like 40 or 50. And a lot of that comes from people who came into movement activity through the Occupy network. And I suspect, although I haven't systematically studied it, that it would be really interesting to look at sort of local level policy outcomes of participation in Occupy as really sort of one of the key. If you want to talk about policy outcomes, that's where you're going to have to look. And I think that you probably will find a lot of stuff. I've heard something about homeless policy in Pittsburgh, that the Occupy Pittsburgh folks worked a lot with the local homeless coalition to modify city policy around resources for shelters. I don't know if that's true. It's a story that someone told me the other day. So I think there's a lot of that going on. So in terms of outcomes, you've got sort of policy, mobilization, discursive, biographical outcomes. Each of them is interesting. And if you want the policy piece, you're going to have to look at state or city level stuff, for now anyway.
A very interesting presentation. I'd like to focus on the eviction of the Occupy sites that led you to have to abandon the plan for a random sample, or a snowball sample online. And I wanted to ask you about your comment that you felt that therefore this did not have scientific value. And I would like to actually suggest it's the other way around. It was a lucky break, and not for the Occupy, but for you, that you did use this snowball sample, because it allows you to do a network analysis, which you can't do very easily, at least with a random sample, which is assuming that all the observations are drawn independently. It allows you to make population estimates, but it does not allow you to understand the ways in which the nodes. It allows you to relax the assumption that everybody arrives at their opinions, beliefs, and attitudes independently of everybody else. And so I think it's the other way around, that it really allowed you to get at the scientifically important question of how, in a social movement, people are influenced. They're not independent of the other observations. And if you do still want population estimates, there are methods that have been developed, particularly by Doug Hackathorn, my colleague at Cornell, that it's a technique called respondent-driven sampling that actually allows you, in some cases, it allows you to first test whether you can do it, and then if you pass the test, it allows you to derive population estimates from a snowball sample.
Well, I'd love to talk to you more about that. I wasn't suggesting that it's not scientifically important. I was just trying to warn everybody that the stats I'm providing, we can't assume that they're representative of all occupiers, because they were drawn mostly through this snowball, mostly respondents via Facebook. But I'd love to talk to you more about that and show you the data set and see if there's interesting stuff you'd like to do with it.
I'd like to go back to a point that you made about the history and the biographies of the movements, because I think that you're on to something that's really interesting. As we see the same techniques and tactics, which I think you're picking up as part of being reproduced across movements, and we're certainly seeing that all the way back from the WTO protests through the independent media protests and going forward. And a lot of that has to do with co-opting networks of previous movements, right? So we're having these same activists who were involved in IMC movements then, or as a group, because they all know each other, decide, oh, we're going to go and we're going to caravan and we're going to set up the tent and we know so-and-so, and they begin to co-opt the networks and almost reconstitute in many ways the networks that allowed them in previous movements to do what they did. So my question is a little bit of, have you thought about both the advantages in terms of, because you're bringing in cooperative networks, so you don't have to build them again, you have no knowledge, which you don't have to do again, but also the downsides of many of the problems that you're talking about with Occupy Wall Street, people were talking about in intermediate media 10 years ago, right? So we had the same participation issues, we had the same issues about egos and who's really an IMC and who's not. We had security culture issues. All of these are being said again and again. Mm-hmm. Is co-opting these networks and these tactics an advantage, or is it a disadvantage? And how do we theorize and think through that in a new media culture?
Yeah, well, I certainly wouldn't use the term co-optation. I would think that I think of Occupy as it's a meso-mobilization space where pre-existing social movement networks are all combining and coordinating. And so that's one of the aspects of it. I mean, we could talk about co-optation, but if I was going to talk about co-optation, I would talk about the TV ad that I saw on my flight here from New York the other day on Virgin, which was some banking and investing ad, which is a bunch of stick figures occupying Wall Street with little signs saying, I want lower price derivatives trading. I want greater, more rapid access to markets in real time. Which absolutely is happening. There's an explosion of merchandising around. But the question is an important one. So on the one hand, sort of experienced movement practitioners bring really valuable sort of life experience, tactics, skills, like into new movements. And this is something that social movement theorists have looked at for a long time. At the same time, they also bring problems, personalities, relationships with each other that can then sort of infect sort of the new movement spaces as well. So I think that both of those things happen. They're important. And mostly I'm just concerned, I'm calling for everyone who's using sort of social network analytics to look at social movements in general, to pay attention to the life course and historical stuff, because I think if you don't, you'll really just be missing a big piece of what's actually happening. Like you could see the formal structure of the network evolving, but you'll have absolutely no idea what this sort of rich texture of personal histories that's playing into how those networks are being shaped. Yeah.
So it's kind of a reconstitution process in some way. The networks are coming back together from earlier points in time, and you want to keep track of those histories.
Well, they reconvene, they reconfigure. There are particular actors who bring tactics and skills from previous networks into the new space. There's also new people with new skills and new ideas and who shape them. So it's just sort of a balanced understanding that all those dynamics are happening, and it gets us away from. Well, yes, the social movements of the new network age are all entirely driven by digital youth who all are producing video and live streaming from their phones and are creating this stuff, like pulling it out of the ether, right? Some of that happens, but a lot of another type of process is going on.
I wonder if you could unpack a little bit more about. You mentioned that part of the structure emerges when they start being surveilled, right? We start having to shift movements and plan different locations and so forth. So there are external pressures that serve to shape the movements and the networks and the way they play out. And so I wonder about, have you looked at who are those external pressures, or what are they? But also the other things that are at the table, the enemies, so to speak, of the Occupy movements, and whether it's big corporations or this sort of thing. Have you been able to look at, I guess I'm thinking about how so much of the network research that we do, we look at the members.
That's right, yeah.
So what about the non-members, but
Right.
they're players that impact structure and the evolution of what it looks like?
Absolutely, and this is a great place to end because I know that my time is up. But so I presented an earlier version of some of this work and some of the findings at another conference in New York 2 weeks ago. And the main response, one, people were really interested in it and loved it, and a lot of people in the room identified as participants in Occupy Wall Street. But the main thing that people all said was, okay, the next thing that the Occupy Research Network should really focus on is focus all of these tools and skills and social media analytics and everything that you're doing, focus that on 1%. They're like, that's what we really need as a movement if we want to grow. So we need to have a much better and clearer and richer understanding of the networks of power, and that's the role of sort of engaged researchers who are interested in coordinating around Occupy. And so I think that a lot of people in the Occupy Research Network sort of took that to heart. And so the Occupy Oakland Research Working Group is now has shifted from spending all their time trying to map the movement network to trying to actually map what is the local structure of the 1% in Oakland. So they're actually they're pouring through tax returns and they're looking at the interlocking boards of directors of the local businesses and how they connect to different people in the mayor's cabinet and all that kind of stuff. And they're sort of starting to produce visualizations and new knowledge along those lines. And so I think that's a great place to end.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.